The morning Emmett Hawkins rode out of Caldwell, Kansas, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of red dust and a wounded silence. Nobody gave much thought to the blind widow living at the edge of his property. Nobody. That is, except the widow herself. Etta Carter had been blind for 3 years, ever since the fever had swept through the territory in the spring of 1879 and taken not only her sight but her husband, Thomas, with it. She was 28 years old the day Emmett Hawkins saddled his roan stallion and came to knock on her door, hat in hand, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of the Kansas plains themselves, weathered, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that either meant peace or pain, and she'd never quite figured out which. The year was 1882, and the Kansas frontier was no place for a woman alone, especially not one who moved through the world with careful hands and a listening ear where other people used their eyes. Her neighbor, old Ruth Presley, had told her once that Emmett Hawkins was the kind of man who wore his troubles behind his eyes where no one could see them, and that matched the voice Etta had come to recognize at her door, low and deliberate, like a man choosing every word before he said it. "Mrs. Carter," he'd said that morning in late April, standing on her porch with the wind coming hard from the south. "I've got to go north. Won't be back until late summer, maybe fall. I've got 3 horses need tending. I know you can't." He stopped himself, and she heard him recalibrate, heard the awkward shuffle of a boot on her porch boards. "I know it's a big ask, but I'll pay you fair. I'll set everything up before I go. You just need to be there for them." She had almost said no. She'd wanted to say no because the idea of it was terrifying, because she barely managed her own small garden and her own small world without the complication of someone else's animals. But then he'd said something she hadn't expected. "They're good horses, Mrs. Carter. They won't give you trouble. The roan's staying with me, but the bay mare, she's gentle as anything. The other 2 are young and they learn fast. I can't leave them with no one." There had been something in his voice then. Not desperation exactly, but something close to it, something that reminded her of the way a man sounds when he has already asked everyone else and run out of places to turn. She understood that feeling intimately. "All right," she'd said, "but you'll have to show me everything twice." He had. He'd spent 4 days before his departure walking her through every inch of his barn, placing her hands on the water troughs and the feed bins, and the latch systems he'd modified so she could operate them by feel alone. He'd driven nails into specific posts at specific heights so she could count them with her fingers and know exactly where she was. He'd built a rope guide from his back porch to his barn door, something she could follow in the dark or in confusion, and he'd done it all without a word of complaint or impatience. The morning he left, he found her already in the barn. She was standing with her palm flat against the neck of the bay mare, whom she decided to call me because the horse breathed with a kind of maternal slowness that made Etta think of warm afternoons. Emmett had stood in the barn doorway for a long moment before he spoke. "You remembered the latch," he said. "You explained it 4 times, she told him. "I was paying attention." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was too quiet and too surprised to be sure. Then he said, "I'll be back before the first hard frost, Mrs. Carter. You have my word." She'd nodded and kept her hand on me's neck, and she heard him walk away, heard the roan's hooves pick up into a canter on the road north, and then there was nothing but the sound of Kansas wind and grass and the occasional complaint of a meadowlark from somewhere beyond the fence line. That first week alone with the horses was the hardest thing Etta Carter had done since learning to find her way around her own kitchen without her sight. She made mistakes. She spilled the grain. She miscounted the paces between the rope guide and the gate, and walked face first into the fence post hard enough to leave a bruise across her cheekbone that lasted 10 days. She sat on the barn floor that first Sunday evening and let herself cry, not from self-pity, but from the sheer frustration of a world that demanded so much and offered so little in the way of mercy. But me found her there in the dirt. The mare walked over slowly, the way horses do when they've decided something, and pushed her broad nose against Etta's shoulder, then against her cheek, and Etta put her arms around the animal's neck and held on. Me smelled like warm grass and summer sweat and something indefinably alive. And by the time Etta finally let go, she had made up her mind that she was not going to fail these horses, not for Emmett Hawkins's sake, but for her own. She found her rhythm within the second week. She learned that the youngest of the three horses, a dun gelding she privately named Dust because of the way he sounded when he moved light and shuffling, like a restless boy liked to be spoken to constantly during feeding, and that the third horse, a dark bay with a scar on his left shoulder she could feel clearly under her fingers, whom she called Shadow, needed to be approached from the right side or he'd startle. She memorized their individual sounds, the particular rhythm of each one's breathing, and the different weight of each hoof fall on the packed earth floor. She memorized Emmett Hawkins's barn the way she'd memorized her own house after the fever through patient repetition and small disasters, and the occasional victory that felt enormous precisely because it had cost so much. She found where he kept the extra rope, the leather oil, the spare buckles for the harness hooks. She found, on a high shelf that required her to stand on the bottom rail of the gate, a small tin box, and when she opened it she smelled dried lavender. She didn't know what else was inside it, but the lavender surprised her. It was not the kind of thing she'd have expected to find in the barn of a solitary cattleman. The weeks slid past. June became July, and the Kansas heat settled over the plains like a heavy blanket, and Etta fell into the kind of routine that kept loneliness at bay, if not entirely at arm's length. She had her garden to tend in the mornings, her horses. She'd begun to think of them as hers, though she knew better, to see to at midday when the heat was worst, because she'd learned that Dust got restless and skittish in high heat and needed extra attention, and her evenings were spent on her own porch, listening to the territory settle into darkness. Her neighbor Ruth came by twice a week and read to her from whatever newspapers could be found, and it was Ruth who first brought word that there'd been trouble to the north, cattle disputes and worse along the Colorado line, and that several of the drovers and ranch hands who'd gone up that way hadn't come home yet. Etta said nothing to this, but she felt something in her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She barely knew Emmett Hawkins. She'd spoken to him perhaps a dozen times before that morning in April, mostly brief exchanges at the general store in Caldwell, or over the fence line between their properties when she'd heard him working, and walked over to ask about a sound she couldn't identify. He was quiet, and she was careful, and they had always been polite to one another in the distant and courteous way of neighbors who have no particular reason to be more. And yet she had his horses, and she had his lavender tin, and she had 4 solid days of his voice in her memory, patient and unhurried, explaining the height of the feed bin and the turn of the latch. July became August, and the nights cooled just enough to breathe, and Etta began to notice that she talked to the horses more than she'd talked to any person since Thomas died. She told them things. She told me about the summer she was 16 and snuck out of her father's house in Wichita to watch a cattle drive come through, the thunder of it, the smell and the noise and the sheer aliveness of it, and how she'd stood there in the dark by the road and thought that the world was enormous and she wanted all of it. She told Dust about Thomas, because talking to a horse felt safer than talking to a person, and she told him that loving someone and losing them were not separate things, that you could not have the first without being vulnerable to the second, and that she had decided somewhere in the last terrible year to be brave enough for both. Shadow she talked to less, but she touched him more. He was a horse who needed contact more than words, and she would stand with her hand on his flank for long minutes while the barn creaked around them, and she thought that there was wisdom in that, in needing the presence of something warm and breathing rather than the explanation of it. The first letter arrived in mid-August, delivered by the Caldwell postmaster's boy, who rode out to her place and read it to her at her request. It was from Emmett Hawkins, and it was short and functional, exactly what she would have expected from him. He wrote that there had been delays and that the dispute over grazing rights on the northern range was more complicated than anticipated, but that he intended to be home by the end of September. He wrote that he hoped the horses were well, and then he wrote, "I hope you are well too, Mrs. Carter. I mean that genuinely, not as a courtesy." She had the boy read that last line twice, not as a courtesy. She turned that over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon, the particular honesty of it, the way a man who chose his words carefully had chosen those words. She wrote back, dictating to the postmaster's boy who had obligingly produced a pencil and a scrap of paper from his saddlebag. She told Emmett that the horses were well, that she'd noticed Shadow preferred to be approached from the right, and that Emmett might want to know that in case it hadn't been obvious before, and that Dust had developed a habit of pulling at the hem of her skirt when he wanted attention, which she found simultaneously annoying and endearing. She told him that Me was the finest horse she had ever had occasion to know, and that she understood now why he'd been so specific about the feed schedule. At the end, after a pause that the postmaster's boy politely did not comment on, she said, "The barn is in good order. I hope you are well too. I mean that genuinely." She heard the boy write it down. Then she heard him stop. "That's all?" he asked. "That's all," she said. September came in with a dry wind from the west and the smell of autumn on it, the particular crispness that meant the long summer was finally breaking. Etta found that the days felt different now, slightly weighted with the approaching end of something. She had grown so accustomed to the routine, her garden, her house, his barn, Me and Dust and Shadow, that she had stopped thinking of it as temporary. She had stopped thinking of it as Emmett Hawkins's life that she was steward of and started thinking of it simply as her life, expanded by 3 horses and a rope guide and a tin of dried lavender on a high shelf. She allowed herself, for the first time, to think about what would happen when he came back. The rational answer was simple. She would hand the horses over, accept her payment, and return to the smaller circumference of her own property. She would go back to tending her garden and listening to Ruth read the newspaper, and Emmett Hawkins would settle back into his own life, and they would be cordial neighbors with a shared history of a summer and nothing more. The rational answer was perfectly clear. Etta was also perfectly clear on the fact that she didn't want it. She didn't examine this too closely, the way you don't press on a bruise more than necessary to know it's there. She just knew it, the way she knew the weight of Me's head when the mare rested her chin on Etta's shoulder, the way she knew the specific piece of the barn at evening when all 3 horses had settled, and the only sound was their breathing and the distant call of something out on the open land. She knew that something had shifted in her, quietly and without announcement, and that Emmett Hawkins's patient voice and his lavender tin and his, I mean that genuinely, had something to do with it. A second letter came in the last week of September. This one was longer. The postmaster's boy read it to her on her own porch, and she heard in the length of it something that the first letter hadn't contained. Emmett wrote about the land up north, the way it opened up along the Colorado line into something so big it made a man feel small in ways that weren't entirely unpleasant. He wrote about a family he'd met, a homestead family named Broussard with 5 children and a wife who made sourdough biscuits that were, in his words, the single finest thing produced on this continent. He wrote that he'd been thinking about Caldwell, about coming home, more than he usually thought about a place when he was away from it. Then he wrote, "I don't know what I expected when I came to your door in April. I know I was afraid you would say no. I know I was more relieved than I had any right to be when you said yes. These months have given me cause to think about things I don't ordinarily give myself time to think about, and I find myself wanting to say more than a letter is the right place for. So I will say only this. The horses are lucky, Mrs. Carter." "And so am I," the postmaster's boy finished reading, and there was a silence. Then he said very carefully, "Should I read that last part again?" "No," Etta said. "I heard it." She sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long moment after the boy had gone, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line, and a mourning dove somewhere nearby made its quiet, desolate sound, and Etta Carter felt something open in her chest that she had kept firmly closed for 3 years. She thought about Thomas, which she still did every day, but today she thought about him differently. She thought about how he would have laughed at her, gently, lovingly, for sitting on her porch wrestling with her own feelings like they were a fence post that needed setting. Thomas had been a man of action and good humor, and he had loved her with an easy warmth that she had taken for granted until it was gone. She did not think he would want the thing that was happening in her chest to stay closed. She thought, in fact, that if she could hear his voice right now, he would say something like, "Etta, for heaven's sake, the man said the horses are lucky and so is he." And then he would grin at her and it would be that simple. She wrote back again, dictating slowly. She told Emmett about the evening 2 weeks prior when a thunderstorm had come through fast and hard from the north, and she'd had to get all 3 horses into the barn alone in the dark, following the rope guide through rain that came in sideways, Me's lead in one hand and her other hand on the rope, and how Shadow had panicked and pulled away from her, and she'd had to stand still in the rain and call his name, just call it quietly over and over until he came back to her. She told him it had taken 40 minutes. She told him she hadn't felt afraid exactly, only very focused. Then she said, "There are things the last few months have given me cause to think about as well, Mr. Hawkins. I expect we will have more to say to each other in person than a letter is the right place for. I am glad you are coming home. The horses will be glad too, but that is secondary." She did not let the postmaster's boy read it back to her. She just sent it. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October when the cottonwoods had gone gold, and the sky was that particular hard blue that Kansas produces in the fall, like the country is showing off before the gray sets in. Etta was in his barn when she heard the roan on the road, because she had learned the particular sound of that horse's gait over the course of the summer, had heard it sometimes in the quiet of her own house, and known it for the sound of someone returning to a place they belong. She had Me's lead in her hands because she'd been doing a check of the mare's left foreleg, where she'd felt a slight warmth 2 days ago that she wanted to monitor, and she heard the barn door open and felt the change in the air the way you do when someone enters a room, that subtle shift in the quality of silence. He didn't say anything immediately. She heard him stop. She could imagine him standing in the doorway of his own barn, looking at her there with his horse's lead in her hands, and she wondered what he saw, wondered if he saw what she expected him to see, a small woman moving carefully in a space that wasn't hers or something else. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and his voice was different. Not in any way she could have clearly described, but different from April, different from the voice she carried in her memory. Rougher, maybe, but also somehow less defended. Like a thing that had been kept behind glass had been moved out into the open air. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, "you made it before the first hard frost. You kept your word." "I did," he said. He was closer now, moving through the barn, and she tracked him by sound and by the way Me's head shifted to look in his direction. "How is she?" "Left foreleg has been a little warm. I'd have the farrier look at it. Nothing urgent but worth watching." "You noticed that?" "I pay attention." There was a pause, and then he said, "I know you do," and the quality of it, the simplicity, the absence of surprise made something in her chest do what it had been threatening to do for weeks. She heard him move to check the mare's leg himself, and she stepped back to give him room, and for a few minutes they were both just in the barn together with the horses, and the horses were calm and quiet the way they always were when things were as they should be. She heard him run his hand along Me's neck, heard the soft sound he made, the small exhale of a man who has been worried about something and found it safe. "She's good," he said. "Dust and Shadow." Dust decided sometime in August that I was his favorite person on the planet. You may have competition for his affection. Shadow is fine. I found out he prefers to be approached from the right. I wrote you about that. You did. I read your letters more times than was probably reasonable. She held very still. The barn smelled of hay and horses in October, and somewhere out beyond the walls the wind was moving through the cottonwoods with that dry papery sound. "I read yours too," she said. Another pause. Emmett Hawkins, she had come to understand, was a man who used silence the way other men used words, not as emptiness but as space for something to exist in. "Mrs. Carter," he said at last, "I'd like to ask if you would have supper with me. Tonight, if you're willing. I'm a poor cook, but I have provisions and I'd like—" He stopped. She heard him try again. "I have things I want to say that aren't suited to a letter and I don't want to waste another day getting to them." "Yes," she said before he'd entirely finished. Then she added, "I'm a reasonable cook. I'll take care of supper if you provide the kitchen." He made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. This time it was a little more certain of itself. "That seems like a fair arrangement," he said. She cooked in his kitchen that evening, which was an adventure in its own right because his kitchen was organized with a logic she did not share, and she had to ask him where things were kept. And he answered with the same patient precision he'd used when explaining the barn to her in April. And it struck her that this was simply how he was with her, careful and clear, and without condescension, as though her blindness was a fact about her the same way the color of her eyes was a fact, present and unremarkable. She made salt pork and beans with the dried goods from his pantry, and biscuits from memory, and he set the table with a quiet competence that she heard rather than saw the particular placement of things, the way he moved around the kitchen giving her space without making a point of it. They sat down at his kitchen table as the last light went out of the sky, and the lantern on the table was the only warmth, and Etta felt the specific intimacy of two people eating together in a small lit space while the October night came down outside. He told her about the North. Not the trouble, he touched on that briefly, the grazing disputes and the hard negotiations between the ranchers and the territory officials, the weeks of tension that had dragged into months, but mostly what he talked about was what the long time away had done to him. He said he'd had more time to think than he was accustomed to, that he was a man who'd spent most of his adult life moving fast and working hard specifically to avoid the kind of thinking that long stillness produced. "And what did you think about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set his fork down. "About why I came here," he said, "to Caldwell, why I bought this land. I came out here when I was 25 after my wife died." He said it simply, and she was grateful for that, for the absence of dramatic staging around it. "She died in childbirth, the child too, and I came west because it was the farthest I could get from Georgia and still be in the same country." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it the way he'd meant, "I mean that genuinely, not as a courtesy." "It was 9 years ago," he said. "I've had time. What I thought about up north was whether I'd been living or just moving, and I think the answer is mostly the latter. And then your letters came and He stopped. She heard the shift of his weight on the chair. "I read about the thunderstorm, you and Shadow in the rain, and I sat there on the back of a cattle camp reading it, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 9 years, which was that I had somewhere to come back to, not the land. The land's been there, but someone who was—" He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer. "You can say it," she said quietly. "Someone who was managing in my absence," he said finally, "better than I managed before I left." She thought about that. She turned it over. "That's not precisely a declaration, Mr. Hawkins," she said, and she heard the smile in her own voice and didn't try to suppress it. This time the sound he made was definitely a laugh, full and real and surprised at itself, and she thought it might be the finest thing she'd heard all summer, this man laughing at his own table in his own kitchen over his own inability to say what he meant. "No," he agreed. "It's not. All right." She heard him take a breath. "I'm 34 years old and I have not said anything like this to anyone in 9 years, so I'm going to ask you to extend me some patience." A pause. "Etta. I'd like permission to call you Etta." "You have it," she said. "Emmett." She heard him let out a slow breath, like a man who has been holding something and can finally set it down. "Etta," he said. "I left in April because I had to, and I spent the summer thinking about coming home to horses. And somewhere between the first letter and the second, I stopped thinking about the horses." The lantern flame moved in a draft from somewhere. She felt the faint change in warmth, and the kitchen was very quiet. "The feeling is mutual," she said, in case that was a question. "It was," he said. "Thank you." They talked for another 2 hours. She learned things she hadn't known, that he'd been born in Savannah, that he'd worked cattle from Georgia to Texas before eventually coming north to Kansas, that he played the harmonica badly and knew it and played it anyway. She told him about Wichita, about her father who'd been a blacksmith and her mother who'd read everything she could get her hands on and passed that hunger to Etta, who had loved books with a specific grief since losing her sight. She told him about Thomas, about the good years before the fever, and he listened without interrupting, and without the particular discomfort she sometimes felt in people who didn't know how to hold someone else's sorrow. "You've been alone a long time," he said. "So have you," she said. "Too long," he said, "for both of us." She found her way home by the rope guide to the road, and then by the careful counting of her own fence posts, and when she was back in her own house, in her own kitchen, she put the kettle on and sat down and let herself feel the enormity of the evening, the way it had cracked something open that had been sealed shut. She thought about Emmett Hawkins's laugh. She thought about the 9 years he'd spent moving instead of living. She thought about the tin of lavender in his barn, which she still didn't entirely understand but which seemed, tonight, to mean something. She fell asleep sitting up and woke in the small hours to the cold kettle and the sound of coyotes a long way off, and felt, for the first time in years, impatient for the morning. The courtship, if it could be called that, the word seemed both exactly right and slightly too formal for what actually happened between them, developed with the same patient care that had characterized everything else about Emmett Hawkins. He was not a man who rushed things, and Etta would not have wanted him to be. She had learned enough in this life about the difference between haste and momentum. He came to her door the next morning with a hat in his hands and asked if she would walk with him to check the fence line on the north pasture. She said yes. They walked for an hour in the October morning, and he described what he saw as they went, not in the exhausting way some people describe things to her, as though her blindness were a deprivation requiring constant compensation, but simply and specifically, the way you tell someone something interesting. He said there was a red-tailed hawk sitting on the fence post at the corner of the north field watching them like it owned the territory, and that the cottonwoods along the creek had gone exactly the color of old copper, and that 3 of his fence posts needed replacing before winter. She told him that she could hear the creek from here, and that there was a family of ground squirrels somewhere to their left, because she could hear the particular alarm sound they made. He laughed again. She was beginning to collect his laughs the way she collected other sounds she loved. Within a week, they had established a new rhythm that included each other. He came to her property in the mornings and helped her with the heavier work she couldn't do alone, the things that required sight or leverage or both. And in the afternoons, she went to his barn, because she was still the horse's primary caretaker as far as me and dust and shadow were concerned, and they seemed to have decided this collectively and without discussion. She sometimes made supper at his kitchen table, and sometimes he appeared at her door with something he'd cooked himself, which was consistently terrible and which she ate without complaint because the intention behind it mattered more than the execution. He was learning her, she understood. Learning the particular topography of her days, the way she worked, the system of sound and touch and spatial memory she'd built to navigate her world. And he did it without fanfare, without the slightly pitying quality she'd experienced from almost everyone else since losing her sight, that subtle lowering of expectations that was worse, sometimes, than outright rudeness. Emmett Hawkins watched her carefully and adjusted to what he found, not to what he'd assumed. She was learning him too. She learned that he went quiet when something troubled him, not a cold silence but a concentrated one, like a man doing arithmetic. She learned that he touched the horses the way some men touch good tools, with a respect that was also a kind of love. She learned that he had an opinion about almost everything and shared most of them only when asked, and that when he did share them they were worth hearing. She learned that he'd had a dog once, a healer named Bishop who died 3 years ago, and that he hadn't gotten another one because it seemed, in his words, like too much to lose again. She thought about that. She thought about a man so accustomed to loss that he'd built his life in careful minimums, keeping everything at a distance that hurt less. The first time he held her hand was accidental and then deliberate. They were coming down from the top of the hill behind his property on a November afternoon, the ground hard with the first real frost, and her boot found a patch of ice, and she started to go down, and his hand shot out and caught her wrist and then her hand, and she steadied. He didn't let go immediately, and she didn't pull away. They stood there on the frozen hill for a moment, her hand in his, the cold air around them, and then she heard him take a breath. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He kept hold of her hand for the rest of the walk down, and she knew it wasn't about the ice any longer, and he knew she knew, and neither of them said so, and it was the most eloquent conversation she'd had in years. November moved toward December, and the territory settled into the cold gray that she had learned to feel as a kind of enclosure, the world pulling in around itself. And she found that the cold didn't bother her as much as it might have, because there was warmth nearby in the shape of Emmett Hawkins, who brought wood for her fire and came to check that her water hadn't frozen in the pipes, and never made her feel like an obligation in any of it. The evening he finally kissed her was in her own parlor, in front of her own fire, which had been burning low and needed tending, and he'd gotten up to put more wood on it, and when he came back to the settee where she was sitting, he didn't sit as far away as he had been. She knew this not because she could see the distance, but because she could feel the warmth of him much closer, and his hand found hers on the cushion between them, and he said her name. "Etta." "Yes," she said, because she knew what the question was. He kissed her gently, the way he did everything with deliberateness and without hurry, and she put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of it, this face she had been assembling in her mind from the sound of his voice and the warmth of his presence, and she thought that she might be the luckiest blind woman in the state of Kansas. He pulled back and she heard him let out a slow breath, and then he said, in a voice that was different from any she'd yet catalogued, stripped down, quiet, like something said in the dark after a long time of holding it, "I have been trying to figure out how to do this since October." "You did fine," she said. He laughed. She felt it against her hand, still against his jaw. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know there's no urgency to the answer. You can take as much time as you need." "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I'm not asking yet. I'm asking if I can ask." She thought for a moment that she might cry, and then decided against it, because there would be time for that later, and right now she wanted to be fully present in this moment, in the warmth of his parlor and his hand in hers. "You can ask," she said. "Then I will, when I've done it properly." "What does properly look like to you?" "It looks like calling on your neighbor Ruth, who I think has been looking after you for 3 years and deserves to know my intentions. And it looks like spring, maybe, if that doesn't seem too long to wait. Give us a winter to be certain." "Are you certain?" she asked. A pause. "Yes," he said. "I just think you deserve to be." She pressed her hand more firmly against his jaw and then let it fall to his hand and held on. "Emmett," she said, "I have been certain since the day you drove nails into your fence posts so I could count them with my fingers. But you're right. We can wait for spring." Winter settled over Caldwell with its particular vast quality, the silence that came when the snow fell and muffled everything, and Etta found that the winter with Emmett in it was a different thing entirely from the winters she'd had alone. He had a way of making the small things carry weight, the way he'd describe the snow on the hills when he came to her door in the morning, or the way he'd read to her in the evenings after she'd told him about missing books, reading from whatever he could find with a slightly awkward delivery that improved steadily as December became January. He read to her from the Kansas newspapers, from a Dickens novel he'd found at the general store in Caldwell, from a letter that had come for him from his brother in Georgia, which he read aloud as much to share it as because she asked him to. His brother was named Curtis, And from the letter she built a picture of a man very unlike Emmett, loud and large and full of opinions he'd share without invitation. And she told Emmett this assessment, and he said, with great affection, "You've got him exactly right." He took her to Caldwell twice that winter, on afternoons when the roads were clear enough and the cold manageable. These were small expeditions that required planning and trust, and she was aware that being seen together in town meant something in the social economy of 1882 Kansas. A woman who was a widow, a man who was not married, seen together with obvious regularity. People would talk. She had been a widow long enough to understand that people talked about widows with a particular kind of attention, and she had learned to find this mostly boring rather than painful. What she had not expected was Emmett's complete indifference to it. He walked beside her through the main street of Caldwell with her hand on his arm, and did not adopt the careful distance that might have suggested nothing was happening. He introduced her to people he knew with a straightforwardness she appreciated. "You know Mrs. Carter, Etta Carter, lives east of my place." And whatever those people read into the warmth of his tone was their own business. He seemed to have decided, without announcement, that the shape of their relationship was not something he intended to manage for other people's comfort. Ruth Presley, when Emmett came to call on her in early January as he'd said he would, apparently burst into tears, which she relayed to Etta afterward with some embarrassment. "I'm not a weeping woman," Ruth said, "but I've been watching you be alone for 3 years and I have feelings about it." Emmett had apparently waded politely through Ruth's tears and then had a very direct conversation with her about his intentions and his circumstances and asked for her blessing, which Ruth had given immediately and with enthusiasm. "He sat in my parlor with his hat in his hands," Ruth told Etta, "and he talked about you for 20 minutes without once making it about himself. That's a thing men almost never do. You keep him." "That's the plan," Etta said. January brought a spell of weather so cold that the water in the troughs froze twice a day, and the horses needed extra attention, and Emmett and Etta fell into a shared routine of the barn work that was, she thought, one of the most quietly intimate things she had ever experienced. The companionable labor of two people working together in the cold, and the smell of hay and horses, moving around each other in the particular way that develops when you know someone's habits and rhythms. He learned to announce himself when he entered the barn from a direction she might not have been tracking, not as a precaution but as a consideration, the way you knock before entering a room even when the door is open. She learned that he liked to work in silence, and that this was not unfriendliness but a form of concentration, and that the silence they worked in together was a comfortable thing, not a gap. Me had become something else entirely to her by now. The mare was not simply a horse she'd tended for a summer. She was a relationship, a long understanding built from months of daily contact. She could tell Me's mood by the quality of her breathing and the small sounds she made, the way she shifted her weight when she was content versus when something outside had caught her attention. Emmett watched Etta with me and made no comment for several weeks, and then one evening in the barn, watching her move through a check of the mare's hooves with quiet efficiency, he said simply, "She's yours if you want her." Etta stopped. "She's yours," he said again. "Me. She picked you in June. I could see it in her from the letter." "A horse like that doesn't split her loyalty." "Emmett," she said. "Consider it a gift," he said, "since I can't give you a ring that fits the season." She stood with her hand on Me's shoulder and felt the sting behind her eyes that she'd been holding off since October. "Thank you," she said, and the two words had to do a great deal of work. February came in hard and gray and eventually gave way to a slow and grudging March, and by the time the prairie grass was showing the first thin green and the meadowlarks were back on the fence posts, Emmett Hawkins appeared at Etta Carter's door on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands. He always had his hat in his hands when he was about to say something important, she had noticed. It seemed to be where his courage lived, and he asked her to marry him. He said, "Etta Carter, you are the most capable, most patient, most quietly brave person I have ever known. I've spent 9 years telling myself I was content with what I had, and I was wrong. I want to spend the rest of my life coming home to you, if you'll have me." She said yes before he finished the sentence. She said yes and reached out for him and found him, solid and warm and real in her doorway. And he held her with a kind of careful fierceness, the way you hold something you've been afraid of losing. They were married in May of 1883 in Caldwell, at the small white clapboard church on the main street, with Ruth Presley and the Caldwell postmaster, and a handful of neighbors in attendance. It was a simple ceremony, short and specific, and afterward there was cake and coffee in the church hall, and Emmett played the harmonica badly for a while, and everyone was politely enthusiastic about it. Etta wore a dress that Ruth had helped her select from the dressmaker's shop, blue calico. Ruth said, the color of the Kansas sky in October, which Etta found fitting. She wore her dark hair pinned up with the 2 tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother, and she could hear, from the particular quality of the church's silence when she walked in on Ruth's arm, that people thought she looked well. Emmett met her at the front of the church, and she heard him stop when she reached him, and she heard the breath he took, and she touched his arm and felt him steady. He said, so quietly that only she could hear, "You are beautiful," and he said it like a man discovering something. She smiled and said also quietly, "You clean up well too, from what I'm told." He laughed, standing in church, and the minister cleared his throat, and they were married. Their life together settled with an ease that surprised her, because she had expected adjustments, the reorganization of 2 separate households, the negotiation of 2 sets of habits and preferences. And there were those things, certainly. They moved into his house, which was larger, and spent a full week with Etta pacing every room and every hallway, rememorizing the house not as a visitor but as a resident, with Emmett patient at her elbow, never guiding but always available, never taking over but always present. They brought me into the pasture closest to the house so Etta could hear her in the mornings. They moved Etta's garden to the south side of his property, where the soil was better and the sun lasted longer, and Emmett spent 2 Saturdays in June digging new beds while Etta directed him, and they argued companionably about the placement of the bean rows, and she won. She learned his house as she'd learned his barn through patient mapping and small disasters and the accumulated authority of daily life. She learned where he kept things and asked him to keep them there consistently, and he was consistent without being asked twice. She learned that he got up earlier than she did, and that he would have coffee ready when she came into the kitchen, and that this was not a gesture of accommodation, but simply what he wanted to do. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not often but sometimes, from something in his past that he hadn't fully spoken about yet, and that when he did she could lay her hand on his chest and say his name and he'd come back quickly, and he'd hold her afterward with the particular grip of a man grateful to be where he is. He learned her too, learned to trust her knowledge of what she needed and to stop second-guessing it, which had taken some time. He was a man who wanted to solve problems, and her blindness occasionally looked, to his eyes, like a problem, and she had had to be patient with him and firm, and they'd had one real argument about it in July, 6 weeks after the wedding, when he'd rearranged the shelves in the kitchen without telling her, and she'd reached for the salt and knocked a jar of preserved peaches off the shelf and cut her hand on the broken glass. She had not cried from the pain. She had sat on the kitchen floor with her hand wrapped in her apron, and she'd told him, with a steadiness that came from somewhere deep and practiced, that her world was built on consistency of placement, and that changing things without telling her was the one thing he could do that would actually make her less safe, not from carelessness, but from a genuine lack of understanding, and she needed him to understand it. He'd knelt on the kitchen floor beside her and been very quiet for a moment, and then he'd said, "I'm sorry. Tell me exactly what I moved and I'll put it back exactly where it was, and I won't do it again without asking you first." She'd told him. He'd put it back. He hadn't done it again. And then the argument was over, which was another thing she'd come to know about Emmett Hawkins, When he understood that he was wrong, he simply became right, without elaborate apology or self-flagellation, just a course correction and forward motion. It was, she thought, one of his finest qualities. Summer turned the prairie gold again, and they were in their first full year of marriage, and the days had a fullness to them that she had almost forgotten was possible. He was gone during the days, out on the range with the small herd of cattle he ran, and she had her garden and the horses and her own household, and they met in the evenings with the relief and pleasure of two people who have had their own day and are glad to share it. She'd begun gardening at a scale that went beyond necessity. She traded vegetables with Ruth and with 3 other families in the area, and Ruth had begun to speak of Etta's garden as something of a local institution. He came home one September evening with a look on his face she'd learned to read by the sound of his footsteps on the porch, a slightly heavier step, a deliberateness that meant something was on his mind, and she asked him about it over supper. "I heard something in town," he said, "about the Browsard family, the Homestead family I mentioned, up north." "The sourdough biscuits," she said. "Yes." A pause. "They're in trouble. The land company is pushing them off, claiming the original grant is invalid. They've got 5 children and no legal recourse they can see." She put her fork down. "What can be done?" "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I know a lawyer in Wichita. He handled my land claim when I settled here. He's an honest man, which is rare enough. I'm thinking about writing to him, see if there's anything to be done legally." "Do it," she said. He looked at her across the table, or she felt the quality of his attention shift in her direction with that particular weight. "Just like that," he said. "A family with 5 children should not be pushed off their land by a company making false claims," she said. "Write the letter." He wrote the letter. The lawyer in Wichita took the Browsard case and, over the following months, fought it to a conclusion that was not perfect. The Browsards kept the core of their land but lost the eastern section to the company, but was better than nothing, and the family sent Emmett a letter in the spring that the postmaster's boy read to both of them, from the Browsard wife, a woman named Marguerite, who wrote in effusive and formal French-inflected English that the Hawkins family had restored their faith in the goodness of people, and that the biscuits were always waiting for them if they made the journey north. Emmett read the letter twice himself, after the boy had gone. Etta heard the paper in his hands and knew he was reading it again. "Good," she said simply. "Yes," he agreed. By the following spring, in the April of 1884, Etta knew she was expecting a child. She told Emmett on a morning when the prairie was just beginning to show its first color, sitting in the kitchen with the sun coming through the east window the way she could feel it on her hands, the warmth of it. He was very quiet for a moment. She'd prepared herself for this, for the particular fear that might come up in him, given what he'd lost 9 years ago. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "And I need you to know that I am strong and I am healthy and I have Ruth and I am not afraid." Another pause. "I am," he admitted. "A little." "That's allowed," she said. "Being afraid and moving forward anyway is what you do. You taught me that actually, though you didn't know you were doing it." She heard him get up from the table, heard him come around to where she was sitting, and then his arms came around her from behind, his chin at her shoulder, and he held on. "All right," he said. "Then we move forward." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Etta chose to take as a gift rather than luck, because the spring and summer were kind in terms of weather and her body was cooperative, and Ruth materialized with the authority of a field general, appearing regularly with wisdom and practical guidance, and a complete refusal to be flustered by anything. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a cold, clear morning with the frost on the grass, and the horses sending clouds of warm breath into the air outside. He was delivered by the doctor from Caldwell, a careful man named Dr. Aldrich, who had delivered babies throughout the territory and who was reassuring and professional without being condescending, and when it was over and the baby was placed in her arms, Etta held the weight of him and felt his face with careful fingers and memorized him. Emmett stood beside the bed and said nothing for a long moment, and she could hear that the nothing was full. "Well," she said. "He's got your nose," he managed. "That can only be an improvement," she said. The laugh this time was half broken, and she held out her free hand and found his, and he held on with both of his. They named him James Thomas Hawkins, James for Emmett's father, Thomas for Etta's late husband, an acknowledgement of continuity that felt right to both of them, honoring what had been without being trapped by it. Emmett never said a word about the Thomas, not a single word that indicated anything but straightforward approval, and she loved him for that with a particular depth, because it told her something about the size of his heart. James was a robust baby and then an unstoppable toddler, and raising a child while blind was, as Etta had expected, an adventure of substantial proportions. She adapted the house, worked with Emmett to put rails and safety measures in place as James began to move, and she learned the particular calibrated attention of a mother who uses her ears and her hands and the acoustic map of a house to know where her child is. She was also, she found, very good at it. She had spent years developing an acute awareness of the physical world through senses other than sight, and those senses now served her in the work of motherhood in ways she hadn't anticipated. She could hear the quality of a sound from the next room and know whether James was content or in trouble. She could tell by the way he moved against her whether he was tired or hungry or simply wanting contact. She could read him, and he responded to being read with a guileless trust that she found extraordinary. Emmett was, perhaps predictably, a devoted father. He was not effusive about it. He was not an effusive man. But his devotion showed in the same ways his love showed, in the patient consistency of his presence, in the way he'd sit with James on the porch steps in the evening and talk to him the way he talked to the horses, like the boy's comprehension didn't need proving before it was extended. He took James to the barn with him from the time the boy could walk, and by the time James was 2, he had already demonstrated an absolute and confident fearlessness around horses that made Etta say a prayer of mild concern and Emmett say, with unmistakable pride, "He's going to be good with them." The territory around them was changing, as territories did. Caldwell was growing. The railroad was bringing new people and new conflicts and new possibilities. And the life of the Kansas frontier in the mid-1880s was nothing like the life that had greeted Etta and Emmett when they'd each first arrived. The old open range was being fenced in by the new barbed wire that everyone had feelings about, and the cattle drives that had defined the territory were beginning to change, as the railroads made them unnecessary in new ways. Emmett navigated these changes with the same pragmatic steadiness he brought to everything. He sold his cattle operation when it stopped making sense and turned the land to a smaller and more sustainable operation. And it was Etta who suggested, in the spring of 1886, that they think about the horses differently. She had been the de facto expert on his 3 horses for long enough that she knew them with an intimacy that went well beyond what most people understood about the animals in their care. And she had noticed, over years of daily contact, that she could read a horse's temperament and physical condition in ways that other people, sighted people, sometimes couldn't. She'd noticed things about Shadow's left shoulder, about Dust's gait changes in cold weather, about the way Me communicated her preferences, that she'd confirmed with the farrier and the occasional veterinarian who came through the territory. "You have a gift with them," Emmett told her once, watching her work through a careful assessment of Shadow's shoulder which had, as she'd predicted, eventually needed treatment for the old injury beneath the scar. "I have time and attention," she said. "That's most of what a gift is." "I disagree," he said, "but I know better than to argue with you." Her suggestion was that they try to breed horses deliberately, using the bloodlines they had, and sell working horses of quality to the ranches and farms that were spreading across the territory. It was not a novel idea, but their execution of it was informed by Etta's particular knowledge, and within 2 years they had established a reputation. She had established a reputation for producing animals that were reliably sound and well-tempered. The The horse breeding changed things economically and also changed something in Etta herself. She had always been capable, had always managed, but this was different from managing, this was building. This was her knowledge, her assessment, her understanding of the animals creating something that sustained their family and earned the respect of people across the territory. Emmett would not have thought of it without her and said so freely, which Ruth, upon hearing this, declared to be further evidence that Emmett Hawkins was a remarkable specimen of a man. "He's all right," Etta said and smiled. Their second child came in 1887, a girl they named Clara Ruth Clara for Emmett's mother. Ruth for the woman who had been looking after Etta since the worst days and who cried again when informed of the name, with the same embarrassed genuineness with which she'd cried when Emmett came to ask for Etta's hand. Clara was everything James was not in the complementary way of siblings, where James was loud and kinetic and fearless. Clara was quiet and watchful and precise. She had, from her earliest weeks, a seriousness that made Etta laugh because she recognized it. "She has your thinking face," Emmett told her. "I can tell because she looks like she's working on a problem that other people haven't seen yet." James was 3 when Clara was born, and his reaction to his sister was one of the most consistently entertaining features of the Hawkins household. He initially regarded her with benign indifference, as though she were an interesting piece of furniture, and then one afternoon Etta heard him explaining, at great length and with evident conviction, to his baby sister, the exact correct way to pet a horse, including the importance of approaching from the right side in Shadow's case, and she understood that something had shifted. By the time Clara was walking, James had appointed himself her guide and protector with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally excessive, and Emmett said once, watching them, "He's got your instinct, the way you knew where to put your hands in a new place. He does that for her." "He does," she said. "Good," Emmett said, and in the simplicity of that word was everything. The year Clara turned 2, 1889, was the year Kansas moved toward statehood. It had been a state since 1861, but the territory's character was still shifting with each decade, and the world of Emmett and Etta's marriage was different from the world into which it had been born. The open range was a memory. The cattle drives were largely finished. The frontier, as it had been called, was becoming something else, something that had doors and windows and schools, and the ambitions of settlement rather than the wildness of movement. Emmett said once in an evening conversation on the porch, watching the last of the October light go out over the prairie, "I came west looking for somewhere without walls, and now there are walls everywhere. I'm not sure I mind the way I thought I would." "Because you built them," she said. A pause. "Because I built them," he agreed. "That's the difference." Ruth Presley, who had been the bedrock neighbor of Etta's difficult years, died quietly in the winter of 1889, in her sleep, which was how she would have wanted to go, and Etta felt her absence as the loss of a particular quality of company, the kind that has been present so long it becomes part of the landscape of your life. She allowed herself to grieve Ruth properly, and Emmett was present for it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, not trying to fix it, not offering solutions, just there. They went to Ruth's grave on a cold December morning, the 4 of them, because James and Clara had loved Ruth, who had been exactly the kind of old woman who believed children deserved to be spoken to as intelligent people, and Emmett put his arm around Etta, and she could hear the wind moving across the open ground and the distant sound of the town carrying in from the south, and she thought that Ruth had lived a full and useful life, and that was what you could hope for. The 1890s came in with change the way new decades always do, bringing things you hadn't anticipated along with the things you'd planned for. The horse operation had grown steadily, and by now they had a proper reputation across the county working horses of quality, from the Hawkins place east of Caldwell. Ask for Etta. She had become a known figure in the local agricultural community, which had required some pioneers to revise their assumptions about what a blind woman could and couldn't know about horses. And she had made these revisions happen with the same patience and precision with which she'd made all other necessary things happen in her life. Emmett, in the late 1880s, had quietly become involved in local governance, not elected office, which did not interest him, but the particular kind of behind-the-scenes civic presence that practical men sometimes take on, where his knowledge of the land and the community meant his opinion was sought and often followed. He sat on the board of the County Land Commission, which addressed the ongoing and complicated questions of property rights and land use that were still working themselves out across the territory. He handled this with his characteristic fairness and his even more characteristic refusal to be moved by anything except the facts of a situation, which occasionally made him unpopular and more often made him effective. He was 43 by the turn of the decade, and she was 39, and they had been married for 7 years and had built a life that was more than the sum of its beginnings, more than a cowboy coming home changed and a blind widow who attended his horses through a summer and learned him through letters. They were, she thought sometimes, exactly what two people who have each been truly lost can become for one another, a place to be found. James, at 7, was already showing every sign of becoming the horseman his father had predicted. He had Shadow's confidence and Me's gentleness and Dust's curiosity, as though he'd absorbed all 3 horses' natures in the years of growing up among them. He also had his mother's precision. He noticed things and held them in his mind and brought them back later, and Emmett said once that watching James think was like watching someone do very careful carpentry. Clara was 4 and apparently in possession of an opinion about everything, which she delivered with a serenity that was somehow more authoritative than volume. She had started following Etta through the horse assessments, and Etta taught her what she taught with her hands: how to feel for warmth and swelling, how to listen to breathing, how to read an animal through contact rather than just sight. Clara was a devoted student, and the seriousness she'd been born with deepened in the work rather than lightening. "She's going to know more about horses than anyone in the county," Emmett said one autumn evening. "By the time she's 20, yes," Etta agreed. "She gets that from you." "She gets it from being taught," Etta said, "which is a different thing and a better one. A gift you're born with ends with you. Knowledge you teach goes on." He took her hand across the table in the way he still did after all these years, with the same deliberateness, the same quiet intention. "You know," he said, "you are the wisest person I've ever known." "You've spent a lot of time around cattle," she said. He laughed, and the laugh was full and warm and completely sure of itself now, nothing of the surprised quality that had been in it that first evening in the barn. There were hard things, too, in the way of a life honestly lived. There was a drought in 1891 that hit the horses hard and required them to sell 2 of the younger animals they'd intended to keep for breeding. There was a dispute with a neighbor, a man named Colt Redman who'd bought the property to the west, who falsely claimed that one of the Hawkins horses had destroyed his fencing, and the subsequent unpleasantness, which involved legal proceedings and considerable neighbor tension, took 6 months to resolve, with the truth eventually established and Redman required to pay for the fence repairs he himself had caused. Emmett handled this with a cold and methodical patience that Etta privately found slightly terrifying in its effectiveness. There was also the matter of Emmett's brother Curtis, who came from Georgia in the spring of 1892 for a visit that was intended to be 2 weeks and extended to 6. Curtis Hawkins was exactly as Etta had imagined from the letter, loud and warm and full of opinions, delivered with the confidence of a man who has never been persuaded that the volume of an argument affects its quality. She liked him immediately, because beneath the noise he was genuinely kind, and because he looked at Emmett with a love that was obvious even in his most aggravating moments. He looked at Emmett the way you look at a person you'd been afraid of losing and are glad to see safe. Told Etta on his second day on the property in a low voice as though Emmett might overhear, I was worried about him for years. After Mary and the baby, he went away from us, came out here and went away, sent letters and nothing in them." "I know," she said. "He does that, he goes away." "Not anymore," Curtis said. "I can see it, he's here." "He is," she said. Curtis gave her a hug at that which she hadn't expected and which she accepted because it came from somewhere real. By the time Curtis left, he'd managed to eat most of their winter stores of preserves and teach James 17 different inappropriate expressions in Georgia idiom, several of which James then used at the Caldwell General Store to the considerable entertainment of the proprietor. Emmett was mortified. Curtis found this hilarious. Etta sided with Curtis, which Emmett accepted with the good grace of a man who knows when he's outvoted. The years settled into one another the way good years do, carrying enough difficulty to keep you honest and enough joy to keep you grateful. And the Hawkins household in Caldwell had the particular quality of a place where things were genuinely all right. Not perfect, Etta had learned in the 3 years after the fever that perfection was the wrong thing to want, that it was a kind of greed that blinded you to the abundance of what was actually present. What they had was real, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. And on the days when it didn't feel like enough, she had learned to wait, because those days passed. Me was 18 by 1893, which was a good long life for a horse, and she slowed visibly in that final year, moved more carefully through the pasture, stood in the sun for longer periods with a kind of elderly contentment. Etta spent more time with her that autumn, the way you spend more time with someone when you understand that the time is finite. She would stand in the pasture in the October afternoons with her hand on Me's neck, and Me would do the thing she'd always done, press her nose against Etta's shoulder with that maternal slowness, and Etta would just be there. Me died on a November morning peacefully, which was the thing you hope for. Emmett told Etta quietly, came to the house and told her, and she nodded and said she'd like a moment, and he gave her one. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and let herself feel the loss, which was a real one, this animal who had found her on a barn floor in her first difficult week and pressed a warm nose against her cheek. This horse who had been her introduction to what it meant to be responsible for something alive and entirely dependent. She allowed herself the grief of it, fully and without shortening it, and then she got up and went to the pasture and put her hand on the warm side of the mare and said goodbye properly. They buried her in the corner of the pasture where she'd always liked to stand, and James, who was 10, was very quiet about it in the specific way of boys trying to be brave, and Clara, who was 6, held Etta's hand and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Shadow and Dust were still with them, older and slower but present, and they had a herd of 12 younger horses in various stages of training, and the operation was thriving by every reasonable measure. Etta had become known not just locally, but in the wider county as someone to consult about horse health and temperament, and she received letters occasionally from other horse people with questions that she answered through Emmett, who wrote her replies and read her the responses. She had also, over the years, begun to teach, informally at first, then with more structure, other women in the territory who wanted to learn the kind of practical animal knowledge that she had built. There was a woman named Frances Aldrich, daughter of the doctor who delivered James, who had a quarter horse she couldn't figure out, and Etta spent 2 afternoons with Frances and the horse, and by the end of it, Frances understood what the problem was, and more importantly understood how she'd found out, and she came back 3 more times to learn more. Word spread the way it does in small communities, and within a couple of years, Etta had an informal reputation as someone who knew horses in ways that were worth learning. Emmett watched this development with the same expression he'd worn watching her check Me's foreleg on the evening he'd come home from the north, a specific quality of attention that was not pride exactly, because pride implied ownership, but something more generous, recognition, the plain, clear recognition of something genuinely extraordinary. He told her once in the late 1890s, when they were both on the older side of their respective years, and the children were becoming people in their own right. James was 15, and Clara was 12, and both of them had already demonstrated the specific capacity of Hawkins' children for strong opinions delivered firmly. He told her, "I was a different man when I came home from the north." She knew this. She'd known it from the first sound of his voice in the barn that October afternoon, the way it had lost some of its defenses, the way it carried less of the careful distance he'd maintained before. But she let him say it because some things needed to be said as well as known. "What changed?" she asked, though she had her own answer. "I came back expecting to come home to horses," he said, "and I came home to you instead. And I understood that I'd been smaller before. Not smaller in any way that's easy to explain. Just, I'd been keeping myself down to a size that felt safe. And then I came home and you were in my barn that you knew better than me by then, and I had to grow back up to what I actually was." She put her hand over his on the table. "For what it's worth," she said, "you were already more than you knew. I could hear it in your voice from the first day, in the way you explained the fence posts." "You could hear that in my fence post explanation," he said, with a warmth in his voice that was also a smile. "A man who drives nails into specific positions so a blind woman can find her way is a man who sees other people," she said. "That's not a common thing. I heard it immediately." A silence, the comfortable kind, the kind they had built over 15 years of evenings together. "Etta," he said, "yes, I love you." "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have since approximately the third letter." "The third one," he said. "Why the third?" "Because in the third one you stopped reporting and started telling," she said. "There's a difference." He considered this. She felt him considering it, the particular quality of his attention turning inward. "Yes," he said at last, "there is." James married in 1904, a young woman from Wichita named Alice Beaumont, the daughter of a horse dealer who had come to Caldwell specifically to talk to Etta about a difficult mare, and had brought his family. And James and Alice had managed the rest themselves with a swiftness that suggested that the Hawkins men were capable of knowing what they wanted when they saw it. The wedding was in October, which was, Etta thought, entirely appropriate, and they came to live on the expanded property. There was room, and James was already deeply involved in the horse operation. Clara, at 17, was clearly going to be her own particular force. She had her mother's precision and her father's stubborn patience, and a combination of both that suggested the world had better be prepared. She had already, that year, won a dispute with a county official about the classification of agricultural land that had caused Emmett to shake his head slowly and say, "I don't know where she came from." "I do," Etta said. Clara did not marry young. She married at 25 in 1910 to a veterinarian named George Ellis, who had come to the territory from St. Louis, a quiet and intelligent man who had apparently recognized in Clara someone who knew things about animals that he wanted to spend his life learning. They were, Etta thought, extremely well suited, because they were both people for whom a good argument was a form of affection. Emmett was 63 by then, and she was 59, and they had been married for 27 years, and the prairie land around Caldwell was so changed from the land they'd come to in the years of their youth that it sometimes felt like a different country entirely. The Wild West, as people had begun to call it with a retrospective romance that hadn't quite been present in the living of it, was what historians were writing about now. The frontier was closed, or so people said, though Etta thought that frontiers didn't close so much as relocate, that the spirit of moving into unknown territory simply found new forms. She thought about this sometimes on her porch in the evenings, with Emmett beside her and the sounds of the current season around them. The meadowlarks in summer, the wind in the cottonwoods in fall, the profound silence of deep winter, the tentative and hopeful sounds of early spring. She thought about the girl she'd been in Wichita, standing in the dark by the road watching the cattle drive come through, wanting all of the enormous world. She thought about the woman she'd been in the terrible months after the fever, relearning everything in darkness, refusing to become less than she was. She thought about the April morning in 1882 when a man with his hat in his hands had knocked on her door and asked if she would look after his horses. She had looked after his horses. And then, by degrees, and with the collaborative patience of two people who had each learned the hard way that what mattered was worth the work, they had looked after each other. They had their first grandchild in 1905, the year after James's wedding, a boy they named Emmett James, which pleased the older Emmett considerably, though he pretended it was embarrassing. Alice was a good mother and a good partner in the horsework, and she had James's patience and Etta's instinct for the practical, and she and Etta moved around the barn together with the easy familiarity of two people who have understood each other quickly. The second grandchild was Clara's boy, born in 1912, and named Thomas for the same reason that James's middle name had been Thomas, because Etta had loved a man named Thomas, and his name deserved to travel forward in the people who carried her love. She could not see her grandchildren's faces. She knew them by weight and sound and the particular warmth of small bodies held close, and by the ways they were similar to the people she already knew, this one with James's laugh, that one with Clara's deliberate silences. She knew them completely, in the way she had come to know everything that mattered in her life, through patient attention and the willingness to understand without seeing. Dust died in 1908, having reached an improbable old age. Shadow was gone by 1905. The horses of the current operation were their descendants and their successors, animals that carried forward the careful breeding work of 20 years. Etta still did the assessments, still ran her hands along the flanks and legs of the working horses, still felt for warmth and swelling, and the 100 small signals that told her what an animal needed. She moved more slowly now, and she knew the barn differently than she had at 30, with the authority of long familiarity rather than the effort of learning. But she moved through it as surely as she had at any point in the years since that first terrible week when she'd walked into a fence post and cried on the floor. Emmett, in his 60s, had become the kind of man who is very difficult to imagine having ever been young, not because he seemed old, but because he seemed settled in himself in a way that made all prior versions seem like drafts. He moved through the world with an ease that she recognized as the ease of a man who has made peace with what matters and let the rest go, and she thought sometimes that this was what she'd heard in his voice that October evening in the barn, when it had been different from April, the first note of a man beginning to figure out what mattered. She had helped with that, she knew. And he had helped with her, had walked beside her through nearly 3 decades with his hat in his hands and his patience, and his carefully chosen words and his particular quality of presence, which was the presence of a man who was fully there. She had not expected, in the dark years after the fever, to ever again have something like this, and she had been wrong in the best possible way. On an evening in the autumn of 1914, when she was 61 and he was 65, they sat on the porch in the long dusk of October, which remained her favorite month, the world cooling and crisping, the air full of the particular richness of endings that are also preparations. And she could hear James and Alice in the barn with young Emmett James, who was 9 and apparently very interested in teaching the youngest of their horses to carry a saddle. And she could hear Clara's voice from the kitchen window as she and George Ellis argued about something good-humored and complex, the way they always did. Emmett had his harmonica. He'd been playing it for 30 years in her presence, and he was still not excellent, but he was better than he'd been, and she had learned to love the specific quality of his playing, which was earnest and slightly uneven and entirely itself. He stopped after a while, and the silence was full of evening sound. "Etta," he said, "what are you thinking?" She considered this. She thought about the barn in 1882, the rope guide in the rain, the thunderstorm and shadow coming back to her voice. She thought about the letters. She thought about a man who had gone north for a summer and come home changed, and a woman who had spent that summer becoming more than she'd known she was, and how those two things had found each other. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I was right to say yes to the horses." He was quiet for a moment, and she heard the smile in his silence because she knew his silences as well as she knew his words. "So am I," he said. She put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and the cottonwoods were going golden in the last of the October light. And somewhere out in the pasture, the current generation of horses moved through the grass. And in the barn and the kitchen, the people she loved most were alive and present and doing exactly what they were doing. And the prairie spread out in every direction under an enormous Kansas sky. And everything, for right now, was as it should be. She thought of the morning she'd stood in the dark of Thomas's illness, knowing that the world was about to be irrevocably different, and how she had not known then, could not have known, that the different world would hold this much. She thought of the morning after the fever when she'd first understood the full permanence of the darkness, had sat in the kitchen of her own house and reached for a cup she could no longer see and thought, "This is the rest of my life, the rest of my life like this." And she had been right about the darkness, because the darkness had been permanent. But she had been so profoundly wrong about the rest of it, about what the life in the darkness would hold. The harmonica started again. She recognized the song. It was one she'd heard him play 100 times, a simple melody without a name as far as either of them knew, something he said he'd learned from a man in Georgia and had never been able to stop playing. It was sweet and slightly sad and completely alive, the way all good music is, and she sat in the October dusk and listened. And her grandchildren would remember this later, young Emmett James and baby Thomas both, when they were old enough to carry memories. The sound of their grandmother on the porch in autumn with her face tilted up to a sky she couldn't see, and their grandfather playing his harmonica beside her, and the particular quality of peace that surrounded those two people. The peace that comes not from the absence of hard things, but from having moved through them and found, on the other side, something more valuable than ease. She had tended his horses while he was away. He had come home a different man. And in the years since, each had continued to change the other, continued to be changed, in the slow and patient way of people who have decided to grow together rather than apart, who have chosen to bring the best of themselves to the same table day after day and see what results. What had resulted was this porch, this evening, these children in the house and the barn, this man beside her playing the same melody he'd been playing for decades, this life that was full and real and entirely, stubbornly, gratefully their own. Emmett finished the song and let the harmonica drop to his knee, and the evening settled around them, and far out on the horizon something was calling, a night bird, maybe, or the wind in the grass, the particular sound of the open land going on past the edge of what could be seen. "Are you happy, Etta?" he asked. He asked it sometimes, still, with the same directness he brought to everything, not as a concern but as a genuine interest in the state of things. She thought about the question, the way it deserved to be thought about. She felt the warm weight of his hand on hers, felt the cool October air, heard the sounds of her family near, the horses in the distance, the specific settled aliveness of a world she knew intimately through every sense she possessed. "Yes," she said, and then, "Are you?" "More than I have any right to be," he said. "You have every right to it," she said firmly. "You earned it." Another pause, the best kind. "We did," he said, "together." "Together," she agreed. And the night came down over the Kansas prairie, soft and complete, and the stars, she could not see them but she knew they were there, knew the sky had them the same way she knew everything she could not see but was certain of. The stars came out over the old wild land and its new settled life. And Emmett Hawkins put his arm around Etta Carter Hawkins on the porch of their house, and she leaned against him, and they stayed there until the night was full, and it was enough, and it was everything.